Good morning, Professor Spooner. How are you today on the day
Good
after the
morning,
summer
Frank. I'm
solstice?
fine, and I hope you are too.
Thank you.
We've been talking about globalization as about us being in the crucial phase of globalization on and off, and we've been talking about globalization as being mostly a social process. That is, it's not only geographical, people interacting more over the total extent of the globe, but interacting in larger and larger numbers. But we haven't talked so much about what the relationship is between the increasing, the expansion of the arenas of social interaction and the environment in which we live, and what could be the reasons for the expansion of these arenas. We've pretty much suggested all the time that it has to do with the growth of global population, and obviously it wouldn't be possible without the growth of global population. But it's occurred to me recently, in the context of other things I've been working on, that there's something else that is involved, which is particularly interesting.
Oh, really?
And it's this, that uh, up to 10,000 or so years ago, when we had not become settled, we were still wandering about looking for food. We knew each other only in terms of personal relationships that had to do with reproduction and socialization.
Okay.
And then after we settled, we began to gather property, and differences in what each person owned became a much more important part. Well, perhaps not necessarily in every case more important, but certainly a very important part of the context of our social relationships. And that sort of thing has been increasing in relevance as the size of our settlements has got larger over just 10,000 years.
Mm-hmm.
And our more and more human minds are working together and innovating more and more, and making human life much more complex, and social life much more complex. So we've begun to interact with each other very much in terms of the differences between each of us in relation to the context in which we live, which to begin with is property. And then, especially in the last 300 years, it's become money. And it's very interesting now that the whole financial context of human life seems to be changing with cryptocurrencies and all sorts of other innovations that have to do with money. But we haven't talked about anything else. And the way I started to think about this was when people asked me to write about Oriental carpets, because that was I've been sitting on Oriental carpets in villages in Iran for decades, doing ethnographic research. And then I began to see people actually making the carpets. And then I got interested in how the carpets came to Europe and America, and the differences in between the way we think about the carpets and the way the people in the villages in Iran thought about carpets. And obviously, having a valuable Oriental carpet in your house has an effect on your relationship with other people. It's not an immediate or immediately obvious effect, but it has something to do with your what should I say, a subtle effect on where you stand in relation to other people that you know. And of course, if you get a lot of Oriental carpets, then it makes a big difference.
Okay.
Well, Now, obviously, this is something that is not just related to Oriental carpets, but then you can think about other things. You can think about precious Chinese vases or other things, types of property that have that would be kept in museums as well.
Yeah. You can think about you can think about Steinway grand pianos.
Yes, yes, that's a very good example.
I'm sitting at one right now.
So. And so the complexity of this sort of thing has been gradually increasing, especially since the late medieval period. Although it was fairly complex in the Roman Empire as well, or at least in parts of the society within the Roman Empire. But something very new and has happened in the last few decades, which is making it much more complex. When I was growing up in the middle of the last century, or the first half of the last century, some people knew a lot of things and some people knew very little. And it had to do with education to some extent, but also it had to do with birth. Mm-hmm. And I'm amused now that the reporting on the process of competition for who will replace Theresa May as Prime Minister in England is taking place all between people who are educated at public schools and at Oxford. Yeah. And it seems as though every Prime Minister in England for the last 50 years was educated at Oxford, or except maybe one or two. But anyway, there's an enormous in modern society. There's how much you know has been a very important factor in the way you fit into society. And what there is to know, of course, has been increasing at an unprecedented rate. And then beginning in the 1990s with the World Wide Web and this continuing digitization of everything, the amount of information available has increased to an extent that we still don't really have a grasp of. I mean, there's just so much information out there, and every day one has to spend time trying to keep up with the way people are trying to communicate with you through information, which is so completely different from the way life used to be, even up until the 1980s. I remember sending my first email message in 1986. But email didn't become the main way for people to communicate with each other until the close to the mid-90s. Anyway, so all this amounts to something which is becoming a major social problem in globalization, which is that we have lost. Our social lives were well organized through in the Paleolithic and through the medieval period, right up until into early modern history, until our material world became so complicated. But we coped with that, and we just became a larger population with much more, what shall I say, differentiation between different statuses in society, but nevertheless we knew how to recognize people and where they fitted in relation to where we fitted in, and how to behave in order to make things work. But with the change in the availability of information, which is so completely different now from the middle of the last century, this has confused everything. I keep criticizing our university curriculum because the emphasis is always on making sure that students know how to write and training them to write properly, but they're not trained how to program or how to cope with the enormous amount of information that is available. So they're not. whereas up until the 1980s, they were getting their information in education from professors. Now the information is all available to them personally, and the professors are actually performing in a very different way in relation to students. But this is not taken account of at all in the way university curricula are organized. So we just haven't coped with this change.
So let me see if I can understand this. All right. When we moved from hunting and gathering to settlements, people began to naturally look at the acquisition of property by people as being a differentiator, and then would allow them to self-reference themselves in relation to people who had more or less property than they did. We move on further, use the Oriental carpet example. I understand that. The same type of idea. If one house on the street has several Oriental carpets and another has none, eventually you find out that your neighbor has valuable Oriental carpets, or if you are the owner of the Oriental carpets, you have a differentiator in your own mind as to how you might feel about yourself as compared to people who don't have Oriental carpets. If I have a Steinway grand piano, I have a feeling about myself as compared to the neighbor who may not have any piano. And now all of a sudden, if the demarcator, if you will, and has been for the past 60 or 70 years, you mentioned the British prime ministers all emanating from Oxford. You could say the same about American presidents coming from Ivy League schools. Based on information or knowledge, let's say knowledge. Now we have a situation where information, which is a sibling or a cousin of knowledge, is available to everyone. So that differentiator that formerly had been there is in fact still there, but in popular notion, since the World Wide Web makes information available to everybody, there's almost an artificial equalizer effect. All right, that somebody who perhaps might be a high school graduate and has no formal education training beyond that has access to the same scope and bandwidth of information that somebody who's a PhD from an Ivy League school or from Oxford has available to him or to her. So that differentiator, that position that people have about themselves in relation to other people, insofar as information and knowledge goes, has been completely wiped away. Is that what you're saying?
In addition, yes, but in addition to this, the information is being manipulated.
Indeed.
In a way that it couldn't be done before. And so all these things are going on in a larger population, a population that's grown from 1 billion in 1830 to nearly 8 billion now, and grown at an accelerating rate. With more and more people interacting with each other all the time, so we've lost our organizing ability. So even the nation state is not working as well as it used to, and we have no organizational structures on a larger scale. So one of the biggest problems as globalization progresses is how a global society is going to be organized, and all the things we might have used without thinking about it in the past to organize global society are up in the air. Mm-hmm. The main factor that makes this so incredibly complicated is the continuing increase and even a continuing acceleration of increase in the amount of information which is in the air around us.
I think you're onto something, because I think that that development has given rise to so-called alternative facts, to so-called fake news. People who are regular people who I apologize here, just a minute. People who have access to information create their own stories based upon what they wish to believe, and are able to marshal disputed facts and throw them back into the face of people who may have more knowledge and have actual access to the real facts.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's a disturbing trend. So where does it go?
Well, I mean, we talk about education being less an introduction to new data and more a training in critical thinking, but still we're not keeping up with the way the context in which we live our social lives is changing as a result of our innovation that has occurred with larger and larger numbers of human minds working together.
Well, I hope we solve it before November of 2020.
We haven't got much time.
No, we better get to work after we finish this call. I'll come right down. All right, well, Professor, thank you very much. This was very interesting. We'll look forward to the next session. I'd like to continue this if you don't mind.
Okay.
Thank
Good.
you. All right.
Bye.
Bye.